In this video, we're going to be looking at question 2 from OCR's End of Unit Programming Techniques. The question is asking us to write an algorithm that will allow the user to enter a word and then count how many times the letter A appears in that word. Both uppercase A and lowercase a letters must be counted. The algorithm should repeat until a word is entered that has 3 or more letters. So the first thing I recommend you do when you're answering any question in an exam paper is underline the key words. So going through the question one more time, create an algorithm that will allow the user to enter a word. And the reason why I underline that is because if we're allowing the user to enter something, we're allowing the user to input. We then count. Count is another key word because it means that we're going to be counting something, we're going to be checking something. Count how many times the letter A appears in that word. So we've got that repetition there of word. So the user's entering a word and we're checking how many times the letter A appears in it. We need to check both upper and lowercase. That's a bit of string manipulation. Letters must be counted, and the algorithm should repeat, so another key word, until. So that kind of until means there's a condition happening. It's not telling us how many times this algorithm is going to repeat. It's telling us that the algorithm is going to repeat until the user has entered a word with 3 or more letter A's. Now, given how much time you have in the exam, this isn't always easy to do. But again, I recommend that if you're trying to understand how this algorithm will work, before you rush off and start writing it, use examples. Use examples to see how it would work just before you start getting into pseudocode, before you're thinking of the different constructs. Just how would it work logically? So let's take a look at an example of a couple of words that the user might input. So let's say on attempt 1, the user inputs computer. So what's going to happen? The user enters a word, and then we're going to count how many times the letter appears in the word. So let's take a look. Well, when we enter a word, we're entering a string, and that means we can actually check each letter in that string. So we check C, is that the letter A? No. We check 0, is that the letter A? No. M, no. P, no. U, no. T, no. E, no. R, no. So I'm counting 0 of the letter A's. So that means I haven't entered a word with 3 or more letter A's, so I'm allowed to enter another word. So let's go, we check the word variable. So V, nope. A, that's 1, so my count is now 1. R, no. I, no. A, so is the letter A present? Yes, so my count is now 2. B, L, E, so at the end of that, my count of the letter A is still only 2. So are there 3 or more letters? No, so I need to repeat this again. So let's go. I entered database. So we go D. Is that the letter A? No. So my count 0. A. Yep. So that's 1. T. No. A again. That's 2. B. No. A again. That's 3. S. No. E. No. But let's check. Have I got 3 or more letters? Yes, I do. So my algorithm's no longer going to repeat and it's going to end. Right. So that gives you just an idea of what your program's going to be doing. It's going to be allowing a user to input a word, so I'm going to check each letter in that word, if it's A, whether it's an uppercase or lowercase a, and it's going to count it every time it finds it. Then it's going to check, have we found 3 or more letters? Yes, and my program can end. No, then we repeat that top part again. Now, what you don't see in the exam, and this is what the examiner sees, is basically the mark scheme. So before I even show you how we could code this, let's take a look at what the examiner is looking for in these questions. So you're going to get 1 point for inputting word from the user, and that's here, entering a word. You get another point for initializing a counter variable. So we said that we're going to count how many times. Now when we initialize, we're literally just declaring a variable. So it's going to be something like count equals 0. We're just initializing it. We're just starting it off, count equals 0, because before we start counting, well, the word is going to be 0 letter as A in it. Our next point is use of a count controlled loop. Now, why would we use a count controlled loop? Well, when we're stepping through a string, when we're actually checking each letter in a string, we're doing a bit of repetition. And we know how much repetition we're going to have. We know how many times we're going to check the letters because we can figure out how long the string is. So we use a count controlled loop, and that links onto a second point there, which means to loop around until the correct number of times, until 3 A's are entered. Now let's take a look at the next point, dealing with upper and lowercase letters. So this is what we call input validation, or input sanitization, to be more correct, sanitization. And this is where we simply use string manipulation, and we can do something like dot upper or dot lower. And that means that whatever the user enters, whether it's uppercase or lowercase, will be changed to just 1. And that means we can really be consistent because, as we know, the letter A and the letter A are completely different to a programming language. So we need to make them both the same when we're checking it. And next point is checking each individual letter for an A. So that means that I'm not checking the whole word. How my programming languages work is I'm going to check C, I'm going to check O, I'm going to check M, I'm going to check P, I'm going to check U, I'm going to check T, I'm going to check E, I'm going to check R. As you can hear, I'm repeating something there, and I'm checking if that letter is equal to A. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a hint. There's going to be a bit of selection in here. And finally, I'm also adding 1 to the counter if an A is found. So that's really important because it specifically says I need to count how many times the letter A is found. And if I'm not counting, I won't know if there are 3 or more letters. So these are the mark points. Let's just run through them really quickly. You're getting a point for inputting from the user, initializing a counter variable to 0 at the start, use of a count controlled loop to loop around until the correct number of times, until 3 A's are entered, dealing with upper and lowercase input sanitization, checking each individual letter for an A, and adding 1 to the counter if an A is found. If an A is found. Now, we kind of already have an algorithm here, but it's not been abstracted enough. We've not removed enough irrelevant details, and we've not focused on what the really relevant details are when we're writing an algorithm that we want to solve computationally. So again, this isn't part of the answer. This is just another process that I use in order to figure out what are the different parts of my algorithm. Now, when we break down a problem, we decompose it into smaller parts, and then we abstract the relevant details out. And I abstract them into these different headings. I want to know, what are the inputs to the program? What are the outputs? Are there any variables? Are there any conditions? Is there selection? Is there iteration? Now, we've pretty much answered most of these already, but let's break it down into terms that our computer system is going to start understanding. We're still only writing pseudocode. It doesn't need to be written like Python, but the closer our pseudocode is to a programming language, the easier it is for the computer to understand. So the first thing, inputting word from the user. We can break it down from here because you're not actually going to have this in the exam. So maybe I'll just remove that for now. Just blank it out. And let's take a look. So create an algorithm that will allow a user to enter a word. So that's, we're entering something, we're inputting something, and we're inputting a word. So let's take a look what we've got there. Great. Erd. Let me make sure I'm highlighting the right stuff. Now, the next thing I'd like to check is any outputs. Is there anything else we're inputting here firstly? No, it's just the user's allowed to enter a word. That's going to be repeated. And if we actually look at our program, nothing comes out of it. It doesn't say we're going to display anything. It doesn't say we're going to print anything. So we don't actually have any outputs. Now, if the user's inputting a word, I need to store it somewhere. So I'm going to store it in a variable, and I can call that variable word. Now, let's just quickly take a look through if we need any more variables. So we use variables to store data that can change. And let's go through our question again and see what do we potentially need to store that might change. So create an algorithm that will allow the user to enter a word. So the word might change because the user is going to enter that, and we've covered that already. Then count how many times the letter A appears. So when we went through our examples here, the count changed. It was 0 letters A, it was 2 letters A, it was 3 letters A. So count is another variable. We need to be able to hold the count somewhere. So let's just have a variable called count. That's going to keep count. And remember, that's going to equal 0. It's going to equal 0 at the very beginning, because before I input any words, before I check, count equals 0. Have we got anything else that we need to check? So we've inputted the word, but remember that we needed to check each individual letter. So when I'm checking each letter in the word, I need someone to actually store those letters, so let's have another variable called letter. And that's going to store the letter that we're checking from the word that the user's input. Now, conditions. I keep saying the word checking, and that's basically what a condition is. It's when we're checking something. So how many times the letter A appears in that word? Both uppercase A and lowercase a letters need to be counted. The algorithm should repeat until a word is entered that has more than 3 letters, or 3 letters. So that kind of looks like a condition, doesn't it? And let's take a look what I've put through here. So I've put count is greater than 3 because that's what this translates to. I'm checking if count is 3 or more letters, and actually that should be greater than or equal to 3. And this is checking something else as well. This is checking letter A, because here, count how many times the letter A appears. So letters must be counted. Letter A appears. So I'm checking, is this a letter A? Is this a letter A? Is this a letter A? I'm checking if the letter is equal to A. That's my letter there. And is it equal to A? Should be 2 equal signs here, because I'm checking if it's equal to. Now, this count, is it selection or iteration? Well, the algorithm should repeat until a word is entered that has more than 3 times. So this is actually the condition for my repetition, and it's a condition-controlled loop. So that means the iteration here is going to be while letter equal to A. So what's happening if the letter is equal to A? Am I repeating, or am I choosing a different part? Well, count how many times a letter appears in that word. So if the letter A appears, I'm going to count it. So that's selection, because I only count it if it appears. And then finally, and this is a trickier one, and you need to kind of understand how you loop through or step through a string to identify each letter in it. And that is where we use a count-controlled loop. A count-controlled loop. And our condition here, I'm just going to say, is checking every letter. It's not selection, it's iteration. And that's actually going to be for letter in range length word, because I need to check every letter from the start of the word to the end of the word, which is whatever the length of the word is. So now I've got my kind of programming terms. I've abstracted my complex problem and broken it down into a set of inputs, variables, conditions, and I've identified what the programming constructs as well. So let's take a look at potential solution to this problem. So I'm going to read the question one more time before we start programming it up. And obviously in this video I've taken a lot longer to answer this question than you will in the exam, but it is just a lot of practice going over and over the questions again, and then when you read the question in the exam, you'll immediately know, enter word, that's an input. Count, that's going to be a variable. Both uppercase, lowercase, that's string manipulation. Repeat until a word is entered with more than 3 letters. Okay, well, repeat, that's going to be a loop. 3 or more letters, it's going to be a condition-controlled loop, and you'll get better and better at it. And as always, I recommend you try the question before watching the video and seeing the answers. So let's take a look at the answer. Well, the first thing that I need to do is input a word. So here we go. Word equals input, enter word. And that allows a user to enter a variable or enter a word that's going to be stored in the variable word. Now the next thing that I needed to do, if you remember, if you remember my mark scheme here, the next thing I need to do was initialize a counter variable to start at 0. And we actually have already done it here. And that's literally just going counter equals 0. Because I haven't started counting how many letters are in that word, so the count's going to be 0. Now, this is the tricky bit, because the first thing I'd want to do is actually start looping through the list, but I'm going to start a condition-controlled loop because everything that happens next I want to be repeated until the count is greater than or equal to 3. So while the count is less than 3, I keep repeating this, because remember, this condition is going to repeat until it is false. So while this is true, this will repeat. So actually my condition here is this. I'm using a while loop in this example. You could potentially use a do until loop, and you could try that out yourselves. So while count is less than 3, I need to check every letter in the word that the user's entered. And as we looked, when we went through the example, when I'm checking every letter, I'm repeating again. And I'm only repeating for the number of letters in that word. So I need to include a count controlled loop. So for letter equal 1 to word length. Now, you could write 1 to word length, or you could write range for letter in range word.length. Now let's break this down a little bit. For starts a count controlled loop. Letter is a variable that actually just keeps count. So letter might be X, letter might be I. In this example, I've used the word letter for my variable name, just because that's actually what's changing. What's changing is the letter I'm looking at. And it's going to go in range of word length. And you could also do this. You could actually do for range in range 0 to word length. Now, what does that word length do? Some of you might already know, but just in case you don't, let's take a look at our example. So computer, well, sorry about that. My word here, let's go using the example computer. Let's imagine that the user inputs computer. Okay? So the length of that word is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 8 letters long. So for letter in range 0 to word length, it means it's going to start at 0, because remember, when we index, we start at 0, and it's going to go right up until 8. And that means we're using a count controlled loop to check every letter in the word. Now, this just makes us loop through that word. So we actually need some code that's going to start checking. And when we're checking, we're probably going to be using an if statement. And let's see. So if letter.upper equals A, so that could also be an equal to. Now, how does this code actually work? Well, if letter, and notice here, letter and letter are the same variable names, and how our count controlled loop is for letter. At the start of our count controlled loop, letter, the variable letter, is going to be holding the value 0. So if letter, so if the value is 0 here, well, if the value is 0 here, dot upper, well, that means the value 0 here is there. And I'm using dot upper because it's going to make every letter that I check an uppercase letter. So if it's a lowercase a or an uppercase a, what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to switch to a variable that does actually contain the letters a value that contains the letters a. So if the letter a appears, so if letter dot upper will make that a uppercase, and if that's true, then we need to count it. So count is going to equal count plus 1. Notice how count was 0 here. If it's not, then let's take a look at the next line. If it's not, then we end the if statement, and we actually keep doing this for loop until we've gotten to the end of our word, because remember it's going to go word length in this case, our for loop is going to repeat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times again. And this if statement is going to be true 1, 2, 3 times. And if that if statement is true 3 times, then count will be 3. And once our for loop's finished, we're going to go back here and we're going to see while count is less than 3. Well, count is less than 3. Count is greater than 3. So that should be next letter. Count is less than 3. So we end our while. And that is the code that we could use. Now there's a couple of things here that might be slightly different, because we've said the algorithm should repeat until a word is entered that has 3 or more letters. So what we should also do is include this here. And we could remove this from here. And that actually means that the order goes, count is set to 0, while count is less than 3, so count is 0, so that's true. The user is going to input a word. We then check each letter in that word. If the letter A is there, we're going to count 1. We do that again until we've checked every letter in the word. If count, we then go back up here, and while count is less than 3, so we're checking, well, in the example where we use database, count is no longer less than 3, so we end the while. In the example where we used computer, count is less than 3, so this is still true. So we allow our user to input the word again. Okay, run through this example, go through the question. There are different ways that you could answer this correctly, but if we take a look at our marks here, I'm going to get rid of this table for a second. Inputting word from the user, well, we've done that. Initializing a counter variable to 0 at the start, we've done that. Using a count controlled loop to loop around until the correct number of items, until the correct numbers of 3s are entered. So we're using a count controlled loop to check each individual letters, and we're using a condition controlled loop, so slightly different there, to loop around until 3 letters are found. Because if this is never false, we're just going to keep checking and 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 keep checking until they enter a word that has 3 letters A in it. And then checking if each individual letter for an A and adding 1 to the counter if A is found. So checking each individual letter, and if an A is found, we add 1 to the counter. So a few different parts to this code and answering this question. Firstly, you need to know how conditional loops work. You need to also know how for loops work, and specifically how for loops work for looping or stepping through a string. And when we step through a string, it's the same logic that you use when you step through a list, starting at index position 0 right until the end of the string, which we work out by using word.length. You need to know a little bit about string manipulation in order to check if it is upper or lowercase. And again, in terms of while loops, you need to know how to just use a running total counter. And that you'll have seen in many different programs and many different examples where, for example, you might be counting how much money someone spends at a till, and their count's going to be 0, and every time they input a new item into the till, the count will increase by whatever they've input. So have a read through the question again, try and answer it. If you're stuck on any of these items, then go back to the basics. Check out how you use while loops, for loops, string manipulation, and those are the kind of more complex parts of this question that you need to understand. But otherwise, quite a simple question. You'd be quite lucky to have that in an exam. And again, we use our decomposition table to figure out what are the similar parts of this problem that we might have solved in other problems, but the words have just slightly changed.